The evening began with a feeling Emily Carter could not explain, a quiet tension that sat in her chest even though the house was full of warm lights and familiar voices, and as she moved quickly through the kitchen preparing dinner, she felt as if something important was about to happen, something she could not stop, while outside the windows the early evening sky over the quiet suburban street glowed soft orange, and inside, laughter rose and fell from the living room where her husband Daniel stood with his old college friends, sounding relaxed and confident, the way he always did around people, telling stories he had told many times before, stories that once made Emily laugh but now felt distant, as if they belonged to another life, and among the group was Mark Reynolds, Daniel's closest friend for nearly 20 years, a man Emily had known almost as long, a man who never spoke loudly, never tried to impress anyone, and yet always seemed fully present, listening carefully, remembering small details, the kind of man people trusted without effort, and Emily noticed him in a way she hadn't before when she glanced into the living room to call everyone for dinner and caught him watching her, not in a way that felt wrong or uncomfortable, but with a seriousness that made her pause, because his eyes carried something heavy, something thoughtful, and she quickly looked away, telling herself she was imagining things, that long marriages sometimes made people restless, that she was simply tired, yet as the night moved forward, she felt unusually aware of every moment, every sound, every look, and when dinner was finally ready and everyone gathered around the table, conversation flowed easily, plates were passed, glasses clinked, and for anyone watching, the scene would have looked perfect, a happy couple hosting friends in a comfortable home, but inside Emily felt disconnected, like she was standing just outside her own life, smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right times, while Mark remained quieter than usual, speaking only when spoken to, yet each time Emily's eyes drifted toward him, she found him looking back, as if he were seeing something others could not, and after dinner, when Daniel and the others stepped outside to check the grill and talk about an upcoming game, Mark stayed behind under the excuse of helping clean up, and the shift in the air was immediate, the house suddenly too quiet, the distance between them suddenly noticeable, and Emily felt her heart beat faster for no clear reason as she stacked plates and tried to focus on simple tasks, hoping the moment would pass, but then Mark spoke, his voice calm and careful, saying her name in a way that made her stop, and when she turned to face him, he didn't smile the way he usually did, instead he looked serious, almost nervous, and asked if he could ask her something, and although every instinct told her to say no, to keep things light and safe, she nodded. And his question came slowly, thoughtfully, asking if she ever felt like her life looked right on the outside but felt unfinished on the inside, and the words landed harder than she expected, because they touched a truth she rarely allowed herself to think about, a truth she had buried under years of routine, responsibility, and quiet acceptance, and for a moment she forgot where she was, forgot that he was her husband's friend, forgot everything except the sudden feeling of being seen, and she struggled to find an answer, because honesty felt dangerous, yet silence felt heavy, and before she could speak, Daniel's voice called from the backyard, breaking the moment like a snapped string, and Mark stepped back slightly, as if he too felt relief and regret at the same time, and Emily forced a smile, called back that dinner was ready, and moved past him, but the question followed her, echoing in her mind as the night continued, as guests said goodbye, as dishes were washed, as the house slowly returned to quiet, and later, when Emily lay in bed beside Daniel, listening to his steady breathing, staring at the ceiling in the dark, she realized that nothing had truly happened, no lines had been crossed, no secrets shared, and yet something inside her had shifted, because a single honest question had opened a door she didn't know existed, and she sensed, deep down, that the evening was not just another dinner with friends, but the beginning of something that would change how she saw herself, her marriage, and the life she thought she understood. After that night, life moved forward on the surface, but beneath it, everything felt unsettled for Emily, and days passed where she tried to ignore the memory of Mark's question, filling her time with work, errands, and small routines, yet his words stayed with her like a quiet echo, and she began noticing small changes, like how Mark seemed to appear more often when Daniel was around, helping with home repairs, stopping by with papers Daniel had forgotten, always with a polite reason, and Emily told herself it was coincidence, but each time she saw him, there was a new awareness between them, not spoken, not acted upon, just present, and it made her careful, made her more guarded with her own thoughts, because she knew feelings could grow in silence if left unexamined, and one afternoon, while Daniel was away on a short business trip, the house felt unusually empty, the kind of silence that makes every sound louder, and when the doorbell rang, Emily wasn't expecting anyone, and when she opened the door and saw Mark standing there holding a thin folder, she felt a brief rush of surprise and uncertainty, but he explained calmly that Daniel had left some important documents in his car, and she hesitated for only a moment before letting him in, telling herself it was harmless, that she was overthinking, and they sat in the living room across from each other with space between them, sunlight coming through the window, and the quiet stretched longer than felt comfortable, and Mark finally spoke, saying he hadn't planned to stay, that he would leave as soon as he handed over the folder, but something in his voice made Emily look up, and she saw a seriousness there that made her chest tighten, and then he said he needed to say something once, clearly, without expectation, and her instincts warned her to stop him, but she didn't, and his words came carefully, without drama, without blame, as he admitted that he had admired her for a long time, not in a careless way, but in a way built on respect, that he noticed how much she carried quietly, how she always supported others while asking little for herself, and that he often saw a loneliness in her eyes that reminded him of his own past, and as he spoke, Emily felt a mix of shock and clarity, because the truth in his voice made it impossible to dismiss, and yet it also crossed a line she never expected to face, and she stood up quickly, her heart racing, telling him this conversation was not appropriate, that she was married, that he was Daniel's friend, and Mark agreed immediately, apologizing, saying he understood, saying he did not want anything from her, that he only needed to be honest once so the feeling would not turn into something worse, and he promised her he would respect all boundaries, that he would step back if she asked, and Emily searched his face, looking for pressure or hidden intent, but found none, only sincerity and regret, and that made everything harder, because anger would have been easier. And when he finally stood to leave, he placed the folder on the table and said quietly that he was sorry if he had caused her pain, and after the door closed behind him, Emily stood alone in the silent house, her hands shaking slightly as she leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breath, because his words had stirred feelings she did not invite but could not deny, not desire, but awareness of how unseen she had felt for years, and that night, when Daniel called to say his flight was delayed, Emily sat on the edge of the bed holding the phone, answering kindly, normally, while inside her thoughts moved fast, questioning everything she had accepted as fixed and unchangeable, and when she finally lay down to sleep, her mind refused to rest, replaying the afternoon again and again, not because of what Mark had said, but because of what it had revealed about her own heart, and she realized with quiet fear that nothing physical had happened, no promises made, no rules broken, and yet her life felt different, as if a door had opened inside her that could not easily be closed, and she wondered how long she could pretend nothing had changed when the truth had already been spoken out loud. In the days that followed, Emily tried to return to the rhythm of her normal life, waking early, answering emails, making meals, and smiling through conversations, but everything felt slightly off, as if her world had shifted by a small degree and nothing lined up the same way again. And she became more aware of the quiet spaces in her marriage, the moments when Daniel spoke out of habit rather than interest, the evenings when they sat together but lived in separate thoughts, and she did not blame him or herself, because she knew life had slowly carried them there, and still she tried harder, listening more, asking about his day, hoping effort alone could rebuild what time had worn thin, yet her mind kept returning to Mark's honesty, not because she wanted more from him, but because his words had given shape to feelings she had long ignored, and she struggled with guilt for even thinking about it, reminding herself that attraction was not action, that awareness was not betrayal, and one afternoon, while running errands downtown, she stopped at a small cafe she used to love, hoping the familiar space would calm her, but as she stepped inside, she saw Mark sitting alone near the window, his jacket folded on the chair beside him, and the surprise froze her for a second before he noticed her. And they exchanged polite smiles, the kind people give when pretending everything is normal, and for a brief moment she considered leaving, but instead she walked over, telling herself avoidance would only give the situation more power, and they sat across from each other with cups of coffee between them, speaking carefully, starting with small talk about work and weather, until Mark finally addressed what sat between them, telling her he was sorry again, that he had not meant to complicate her life, that if she wanted him to disappear from her world completely, he would understand, and Emily listened, feeling the weight of choice pressing down on her, and she surprised herself by saying he had not created a problem, that he had only spoken a truth she had been afraid to admit, and Mark looked relieved but sad at the same time, saying he respected her marriage and would never step beyond what was right, and that honesty, rather than easing her mind, made her reflect more deeply, because she realized the real struggle was not between two men, but between silence and truth. And later that evening, when Daniel mentioned plans for the weekend without really looking at her, Emily felt a quiet ache, not anger, but longing to be seen, and she understood then that her marriage needed words, not patience alone, and that ignoring her feelings would only turn them into resentment. And as days passed, Mark kept his distance, no calls, no visits, only quiet respect, which gave Emily the space to think clearly, and in that space she realized that her emotions were not something to fear, but something to understand, because they pointed toward a deeper need for connection, and she spent long nights awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, not with regret, but with growing clarity, and she finally accepted that the hardest truth was not that someone else had noticed her, but that she had allowed herself to disappear within her own life, and that realization marked a turning point, because for the first time in years, she knew she had to speak honestly, even if the outcome was uncertain, because living quietly unhappy was no longer an option. The choice Emily faced was not sudden but clear, and one quiet weekend morning, with sunlight filling the kitchen and the house calm, she asked Daniel if they could talk, and her voice was steady even though her hands trembled, and she did not mention Mark or any outside influence, because she knew this conversation was about them, about the space that had grown silently between two people who once felt inseparable. And she spoke honestly, telling Daniel she felt lonely even when they were together, that routines had replaced connection, that she missed being seen and heard, and Daniel listened at first with surprise, then with concern, and as the words continued, something shifted in him, because he realized she was not accusing but opening a door, and he admitted he had felt distant too, pulled into work and responsibility, assuming comfort meant everything was fine, and the conversation moved quickly, not with anger, but with truth, touching old memories, missed chances, and unspoken needs, and though not every problem was solved, something important happened, because they both acknowledged the gap instead of ignoring it, and in the days that followed, they made small changes, shared meals without phones, longer walks, deeper talks, and while the future remained uncertain, the effort felt real, and through it all, Mark remained absent, respecting the boundaries he had promised, until one afternoon Emily received a short message from him, simple and kind, saying he hoped she found peace and clarity, and reading it brought neither excitement nor sadness, only gratitude, because his honesty had served its purpose and nothing more, and Emily realized that not every connection was meant to last, some existed only to reveal what had been hidden. And as weeks passed, she felt more grounded, more present in her own life, aware that choosing honesty had not been easy but had been necessary, and she understood that love was not always about romance or desire, but about courage, about facing uncomfortable truths before they hardened into regret, and whether her marriage grew stronger or took a different path in time, she knew she would no longer silence herself, and standing one evening at the window watching the quiet street, Emily felt calm, because she had learned that the most unexpected words do not always lead to new beginnings with others, but often guide us back to ourselves, and that understanding, once reached, changes everything.